I am the director of SEIZAN Gallery. It feels almost unreal to have those amazing guests here tonight to discuss two of my favorite artists and also the legends of this city. To begin, I'd like to introduce the two moderators for the evening. They will in turn introduce our guest speakers. First, from Tokyo, Japan, Motoyuki Shibata. Moto is a renowned translator, writer, and scholar, as well as the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the acclaimed literary magazine Monkey.
Which is on sale.
Anyone in Japan with an interest in contemporary English literature would agree that Moto is one of.
Hey, I don't count.
Let me finish my Moto is one of, if not the most influential figures in bringing a wide range of English language writers to Japanese readers. Among them is Paul Auster. Moto has translated nearly all of Auster's works into Japanese, playing a key role in Auster's popularity in Japan. Next, I'm honored to introduce Pauline, a curator of photography at the Brooklyn Museum and a board member of Soul Leiter Foundation. Pauline helped organize Soul Leiter's first European exhibition at the Foundation Henri Cartier-Bresson in Paris and curated his major solo show in Tokyo in 2020. Both she and Moto contributed to All About Soul Leiter, one of Leiter's first major catalogs in Japan, which sparked his widespread recognition there as well. They do much more than I just explained, but I'm trying to keep it short and honest. I also like to thank Rasset Rederman from 10 by 10 photo books here, who also runs the Good collection, copies of their edition featuring Soul Leiter and Paul Auster available for purchase tonight, so please make sure to take a look after the talk. And now I'll hand my microphone to Moto.
Thank you, Sayaka. My name is Moto Shibata, and the greatest luck of my life was that I became Paul Auster's translator. Also, fortunately, I was asked to make the Japanese subtitles of the Soul Leiter documentary In Great No Hurry. So even though I don't count myself, I'm here as a sort of hinge to connect the two great artists. And out of all the possible topics on those two great artists, we are going to focus on the city of New York they observed and reinvented. And next to me, sitting Sam Messer, is the wonderful artist who worked with Paul Auster. The main collaboration is The Story of My Typewriter. Do I get the title right?
Yeah.
The Story of My Typewriter is the combination of Paul Auster's text and Sam's great paintings. You can see one of his new typewriter painting over there. And incidentally, not incidentally, but they have wonderful photographs and paintings by Saul Leiter, as well as some photographs concerning Paul taken by his son-in-law, Spencer Ostrander. So please take a look after the talk over there. First, are you going to introduce those two?
Yes, yes, and then we can start the conversation. Yes, so we'll go. Moto is going to start the conversation, but just to introduce Margit, I did a combination. Margit, Herb, and Michael Parillo, who are the directors and president. Remind me the title exactly, but you're running the Soul Leiter Foundation, and so we're going to be talking about Soul Leiter. We're going to start talking about Paul Auster, and then we'll talk about Soul Leiter together, and then we can cross those bridges.
So first, I'm going to ask Siri. Did I introduce you? I'm awfully sorry, Siri. I'm always doing this. Siri Hustvedt, writer of many books of fiction and non-fiction, and also a longtime partner of Paul Auster. First, I'm going to ask you about the very first passages on New York I encountered in Paul's books. That was City of Glass. About 2 pages into the book, there was wonderful passage about New York being a labyrinth, and the end of the paragraph was, and this finally was all he ever asked of things, to be nowhere. New York was the nowhere he had built around himself, and he realized that he had no intention of ever leaving it again. And this reading this passage was the moment I fell in love with Paul Auster's work. But you were always Paul's first reader.
Yes.
Do you remember the moment when you read, well, maybe not just this passage, but the very beginning of City of Glass?
Yes, this is, Paul and I came to New York in 1978 to go to Columbia University. I got my PhD in '86, and we met in 1981. When we met, he was writing the second half of The Invention of Solitude, and he started writing City of Glass after we moved in together. We decided to move in together 1981 in the fall. And I actually have finished a memoir after Paul died on April 30th. I started writing about 2 weeks after he died. This is a strange thing because you write and you look up documents. And one of the documents that I hadn't looked at since 1981 were letters, 3 letters that I wrote him, including comments about him telling me the story of City of Glass. So I remember vividly now, because I reread the letter, I didn't remember. And it's interesting because he says, I said, I think it will be wonderful without a lot of metaphysics, which is what Paul told me. It is, in fact, a philosophical novel, very much so. But I think he wanted that to sink. And even the passage you read, of course, about nothing, you know, it opens the door to endless philosophical possibilities, which is what the novel engages in, and then the 3, which are, in a sense, telling the same story in 3 different ways. So I remember reading the manuscript of City of Glass and thinking to myself, no one has written a book like this before. And actually a lot of the themes were themes that we were very interested in. You know, words and things. You know, what is the relationship between words and things? These were discussions. Both of us were interested in Wittgenstein, so we had long discussions about this. And when he was writing the trilogy, I was writing my dissertation, which is about language and identity. So we crossed in many ways.
And then I read your take on New York City in your first novel, The Blindfold, and your views on New York overlaps a little bit with Paul's, but very generally your New York was felt more physical, sometimes even visceral.
That would be true. I think actually that turns on gender, right? So that book is about a young graduate student alone in New York City, and there's an atmosphere of both threat and what I set out to write that book thinking very much about the unheimlich, as you know, Freud's famous essay on the uncanny, that feeling of the uncanny. And I think I had that, but it's also the greater threat that young women feel than a young man.
You said you thought no one read the book, no one had written a book like this when you read the manuscripts of the City of Glass. But I also felt when I read your book, no one had really written about a female young woman coming into the city and turn her life into a kind of Bildungsroman.
Yes, yes. Yeah, I think, you know, what happens, of course, is that that kind of story was impossible before a certain moment, right? Especially for women of, you know, a certain class, middle class women. So it wasn't until the 20th century that you could have those stories. And of course, New York is, I think for me, and I think for Paul in a somewhat different way, it is a kind of living organism. It's like a character. Yeah. You know, and the shifting nature of New York City, which I think everybody who lives here feels, unlike, say, Paris. Paris, I love to go to Paris because I can find like the same places. You know, it doesn't reinvent itself every 5 years. So, you know, the chameleon aspect of New York, and I think Paul really, and of course, the relationship between, let's say, the material of the city and language. This is something that deeply interested him. Again, words and things. What is the relationship? And then by putting the walk, right, the Stillman's walk, into the streets of the city, and it's spelling the Tower of Babel, right? So there's something about that imposition of the language into the actual material of the city through the walk. And you know, Paul read a lot of French literature, and the idea of the flâneur, you know, out of Baudelaire, wandering around, and then that it's making words. I think, you know, this is something that he was deeply interested in. The touch, you know, the word cannot get the thing, but the actual walking in the streets is getting close.
Do you think he could have done that with the city of Paris instead of New York?
No, but Paris does figure in some of the novels.
Oh yes, of
it
course. Yes, yes.
But I think New York became the place. And of course, he lived here, and when he was a boy, his grandparents lived on Central Park South. So he had a long relationship with the city. And I was looking through 4321 today, which is New York is just bursting out of that book. It's just both historically and physically, the streets. So, yeah, he kept returning to New York. He thought of it as his city.
Okay, so getting down a little bit from the philosophical height to
something
less
more mundane, okay?
Paul often wrote about people who are a little bit strange or deranged when he wrote about New York. And I did a little bit of homework, and I found your own article in the New York Times New York observed. And you also wrote about a number of strange people you tend to encounter in the city of New York. I find it hard to imagine to talk about a city like that. I mean, for instance, to talk about Tokyo by referring to, a bunch of strange people you encounter there.
Right, so you're saying not Tokyo?
No.
No.
And not Paris either.
No, I think that's right.
No.
But New York encourages that, don't you think? I mean, it's not...
Why?
Well, I think the subway is a rich human place, right? For everybody, right? And Paul, the dispossessed, right? In a sense, the idea of dispossession keeps coming up again and again and again. So many of the books start with something terrible has happened. People they've lost, in City of Glass, right? Quinn has lost his family. And that nakedness, I think, especially in the early works, interested Paul greatly. Like this existential nakedness, what happens then? But he was, also, I think, very interested in human connection. There is no self without another. And some of the people, the strange people that we all meet in the street, are part of that drama of human dispossession. And, what happens when everything has been taken away from you.
May I ask your favorite description of New York City by Paul?
Yeah, this is not my favorite. I'm a person who rejects the idea of favorites.
I'm sorry.
So everyone knows. No, it's fine. It's fine. It's just, when you're a writer, you're always asked to do like your 10 favorite novels and what are they and everything. And I always do 10 different ones every time I'm asked. This is actually, I chose this. It's from The Art of Hunger. Later was collected in his collected prose. But I chose because he's writing about Charles Reznikov, a poet of New York, who was born in Brooklyn, and a brilliant poet. But you're going to understand why I picked this little piece. And it's about, in New York isn't actually mentioned, but it is about looking and walking in New York. The feeling that emerges from these glimpses of city life is a rough equivalent to what one feels when looking at a photograph. Cartier-Bresson's decisive moment is perhaps the crucial idea to remember in this context. The important thing is readiness. You cannot walk out into the street with the expectation of writing a poem or taking a picture, and yet you must be prepared to do so whenever the opportunity presents itself. Because the work can come into being only when it has been given to you by the world, you must be constantly looking at the world, constantly doing the work that will lead to a poem, even if no poem comes of it. Reznikov walks through the city, not as most poets do, with his head in the clouds, but with his eyes open, his mind open, his energies concentrated on entering the life around him, entering it precisely because he is apart from it. And therefore this paradox, lodged in the heart of the poem, to posit the reality of this world and then to cross into it, even as you find yourself barred at all its gates. The poet as solitary wanderer, a man in the crowd, as faceless scribe, poetry as an art of loneliness. I think it's very beautiful.
Wow, thank you.
The photograph and the poem meet.
Yes, I always thought Charles Reznikoff's poetry has something close to Saul Leiter's photography in its almost hike-like brevity, but
Yes,
the passage you read is
no, but I think
perfect
that's
bridge.
the place, right? Because it's a kind of phenomenology, right? It's that, you know, I was reading it again today and I thought, oh God, you know, it's like Paul read Merleau-Ponty, the French philosopher that he quotes actually in this essay, and but he never read Husserl that I've been working on my entire life. But Husserl talks about bracketing the natural attitude, which means that you get rid of all the conventions and all the junk, you know, the social junk that is getting in the way of perception. And I think that's relates to Leiter perfectly.
Absolutely, and what the decisive moment, which has become so well known for Cartier-Bresson, but he was always saying you have to be aware and open, otherwise there's no chance to meet the photograph, right? There's no chance to, and this is so beautiful. I didn't know that it's incredible. That's exactly what Cartier-Bresson would always say about photography.
Okay. Thank you very much, Siri. Okay, so now we can ask Sam to provide another dimension of Paul Auster.
Yes. And so this was a very Austerian moment how I met Sam Messer. So Sam had worked, I worked with Brooklyn Museum. Sam had a beautiful typewriter included in the show of Brooklyn artists. And I couldn't help but notice the name, which is Sam Messer, which is, as Sam pointed out, one letter away from my son, Sam Lesser. So that's how it was started. But also the typewriter kept following me wherever I went. It was shown. It was a very strange thing, really very odd, and also very Saul Leiter, those coincidences, and very photography. But so I went. So the gallery connected us in the fall, and so I explained the situation of Sam Messer, Sam Lesser, the typewriter that keeps coming back, Paul Auster. And so we met and went to the studio of Sam, who is in Brooklyn. And at the very end of the conversation, we talked about the typewriters, we talked about, you know, painting mostly, but photography. And suddenly, and Sam reminded me how this came up, but Sam showed me photos, the photoplasms, so we need to talk about that, the name of them, the title. Incredible photographs that Sam had made of Paul Auster, but not just made of him, but then transformed. Hence, so that there's a transformation, and they're here in the show, some of them. And so I'd love, Sam, for you to tell us about those portraits and the title of why photoplasm.
So it's a long, winding, coincidental story, which goes along with you calling, right? Which is like it's right out of Paul's book. And I was always wondering why I'm part of this. But so all of a sudden I figured it out. So I would say it goes back to effing in Moon Palace, and which ties into your Strange People. And only because I say that because I reached out to Paul, who I didn't know, but through I knew John Kessler, his brother-in-law, and I said, you know, I'm a big fan, and because I needed someone to write a blurb for a book, and I had already asked all the writers I knew, which was one. So, and John said, well, Paul doesn't write blurbs, but here's his address. And he wrote me the most beautiful blurb and said, if you ever come in Brooklyn, come by. And I mentioned, so he wrote this blurb for a book, and this was about this man, John Searle, who I took these photos of. And in those photos, my wife Eleanor, who's here, I painted John Searle in his coffin. I went to the funeral parlor and made the last painting of him there. And there was a roll of like 35 negative film, and every frame was perfect, except one when Eleanor said, you know, John didn't have his shoes on, we need to put his sneakers on, he loved them. And she took a picture of me putting his shoes on, and that photograph was just totally blown out. So you could see me, the coffin through me, there was this, and then the picture afterwards where I wasn't touching was fine again. And this was 1993. And then I went and I showed that negative to many photographers because I was teaching at Yale at the time, and I showed them to all these people, and they were like, well, we don't know, but maybe there's, you know, some like lighter energy happened there, but we don't know. So the following year, I went back and I took John, we inherited John's dog, and I went back to the place, and I took pictures just to see if anything would happen again, and nothing did. So then I wanted to make that feeling again that happened in that photograph of patches where John lived. And I started making, I would take the negatives and tape them to the window of an airplane when I was commuting from LA to New York and getting on the train to New Haven. And I would work on the plane with like acid and bleach and my etching needle, this was all pre 9/11. And I would go into Yale, and then I would get photo students to print them for me. And I built up, first they were all of John. And then I showed them one day, I was so excited, I had printed some, and I remember I was standing in the hall with Todd Papageorge, who is a well-known photographer. He'd been the director of the Yale photography program for 30 years. He worked in the Cooper Union photo department when I was a student. I remember him lurking in the back vaguely. Anyway, I showed them to Todd, and I was like so excited. I said, Todd, look at my photographs. And he looked at them and said, Sam, you are not making photography, you are desecrating photography. And I was so like downtrodden, and I remember right after that, because I would come to New York, you know, I would commute to New York, and I went and I saw Paul, and I told Paul the story. And he looked at me, and just the way Paul would do, without missing a beat, he just looked at them and looked at me and said, well, that's true. That's because these are photoplasms. And that's where they got their name. And so then I started I took some of the photos I did of Paul, and I worked on those. And the ones that are here, the larger one with him, and there's smoke, and it's Brooklyn Bridge in the background, and it's New York. That was taken in Boston, probably 1991 or 2. He was giving a reading, and I was teaching up there, and I went and met him. And the smaller one, is interesting, was taken at Toby Pond in Norfolk, Connecticut, which is also the home of New Directions Press. Yeah. And it's also, that was the weekend that Paul and Siri and Sophie came and visited us, and Paul wrote the story for The Story of My Typewriter while they were there. And I just want to say that Todd Papageorge, like that story, and then thinking about Saul Leiter, makes me realize, you know, we have such bad education in this country, even at the highest level. So I went to Cooper Union, and then I went to Yale, I dropped out, but then I was the associate dean forever. I really didn't know who Paul Leiter was until this event. And I reached out to some photographer friends of mine who were teachers and very well-known photographers, and they all love him. But did Papageorge or Richard Benson or Peter Galassi or any of them ever talk about him or include him in this archive? No. You know, and they would give all these lectures and talks like Freelander. And it just shows me, and I think that the moment, like Siri read what Paul was talking about, when you mentioned, I'm a novice at this, but they have a very different feeling than those other New York street photographers in the sense of their idea of that moment, I forget what you call it. Decisive moment. Those are more like a decisive feeling. Like they really feel like New York. Like I look at them and they're, you know, the color, the way everything is compressed, the way there's movement and stop, but still, it's a very different thing, and it just seems like it doesn't fit into this very specific narrative. Like, I'll also just throw this out. They all would say about William Eggleston, who personally I have issues with, but as a photographer, he's amazing. Oh, the only reason anyone knows his work is because John Sikowski put that book together. Otherwise, no one would know who Eggleston is. And they would just say, he's just a drunk. Oh. They would just say, he's just a drunk and he never would do something. And so I think, you know, this idea of how people get into a canon is it's interesting. So anyway, I appreciate being part of this for that.
This is what started everything.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
This
Yes,
is
there's the big
portrait of John Searle,
Yeah.
who reminded Paul of one of his characters, Effing in
Yes.
Moon Palace.
And I just have to say, because Paul, I had not read this, and Paul wrote to me and said, and his blurb said, I feel like you found the real life effing.
Right.
And so I read Moon Palace, and Moon Palace, there were so many coincidences. Like, his father died on the date my father died, but the book ends in...
I love that
But,
stuff.
but then the book ends in Lake Elsinore, California. And he walks all the way across America, and he's standing on the shore of Lake Elsinore, California, which was literally a block and a half down from where John's house was.
Wow.
And one of the last calls I had with Paul was September, May, I forget what it was. I went back to Lake Elsinore because I put a show together of John Searle's work. So I called Paul from Lake Elsinore, and I had reread
Moon Palace.
Moon Palace, and I just finished it, so I called him from the beach of Lake Elsinore.
The music of chance, guys.
Sam, I love what you say about the decisive feeling as opposed to decisive moment, because I think, you know, when the Soul Leiter show, and I'll ask you now if you don't mind telling us a little bit about Saul Leiter. But when we did the show, the Cartier-Bresson Foundation in 2008, it was the first time most people had heard of him, thanks to the Howard Greenberg Gallery, where Margit used to work at the time. And so in France, it was an incredible revelation, to the point that we were at the time in a small building in Montparnasse, and there was a line around the block, which we had not even seen when we did Giacometti Cartier-Bresson, which are two big names. Saul Leiter, that nobody knew. The line was, and I sent you photos, and it was the time of the cherry blossoms, it was incredible. And then same thing happened in 2017 when we did All About Saul Leiter in Tokyo. Nobody had, I mean, some people had seen the film that you had worked on, but it was still very confidential. And again, the crowds came, and I think the idea of the decisive feeling is really exactly what it is, because it's unexplainable, a bit like Paul Auster. There's a bit of a mystery around, it's not clear.
No.
And so you can get in other ways that are more oblique. It's not about geometry, for instance, as some people love in photography, although there is beautiful geometry, but you know, it's more about the feeling of what that photograph conveys. And I feel like this is something that we have found, that we felt, some of us, both about Paul Auster's writing and Saul Leiter's images, is that they bring you in ways that you would not, you don't know why. It's the uncanniness and the unknowable. But so, I would love for Margit and Michael to tell us about who Saul Leiter was. He's New York. Where did he come from? What kind of man was he?
Yeah. Well, it's a story that I love to tell until the cows come home, and I get a chance to do it often in many countries, including Japan recently, where Saul has gotten, as Pauline said, so much attention. It's just been overwhelming. But Saul Leiter and his photographs have been orbiting around me since almost 30 years now. I came to New York after I graduated college, and I was really interested in photography, and I went to MoMA, and I thought, well, I'll just go and see the bookstore, and there was a magazine there called Photography in New York, and I thought, well, those are two things I like, photography in New York, so I picked up the magazine, and I saw an advertisement for a gallery, and I was very lucky. It was in Soho, and I got a job answering the phones. I was 23 years old, long time ago now. And Saul Leiter was one of the photographers that this gallery, Howard Greenberg Gallery, represented. But he was not known at all. In fact, he was a charity case for the gallery. So this is 1995.
Okay.
And to back up a little bit about Saul's story in New York, and then I'll connect the two. He was born in Pittsburgh to an Orthodox Jewish family. His father was a rabbi. And Michael Greenberg, in his essay, recently said that almost all conversations with Saul always ended with him talking about his father. And the anger and the love that and the respect that he had for his father. Saul was supposed to be a rabbi, just like his two brothers. He was born in a family of 4. He had a sister as well. 1923, he was born. And he was sent to school early in the morning. He got up at 5, he studied the Talmud. He went to school, he came home, he had a Hebrew teacher. He said his life was all about studying what God wanted. That's what he was expected to do. And he resisted it, I think, starting pretty early. Around 13, he got a camera from his mother. He had begged her for it. He was already painting at that point, at 13 years old, and he fell in love with art. He snuck away to the University of Pittsburgh Library, a nice kind librarian let him in, and he would study all summer long and on weekends in the University of Pittsburgh Library. One day he would study Greek, the next day he would study African sculpture. He basically taught himself art history. He took photographs of his home life, his parents, his sister, his brothers, and quite a few of them were self-portraits. He took up painting because a girlfriend of a friend had painting. He thought, well, I could do that too. His first painting was an imitation of a Vermeer.
Oh.
He copied a Vermeer, which says a lot about Saul. So he went to rabbinical school for a very short period of time. He also went to the University of Pittsburgh for a very short period of time and dropped out. I think school was more like jail to him. And when he left rabbinical school, he came to New York. He wanted to pursue being a painter. He wanted to find maybe a mentor or someone that could inspire him. He had gone in Pittsburgh to a symposium with John Cage and Merce Cunningham, and I think that may have inspired him to come to New York. Two very, very creative men, a gay couple who were managing to make it work, and he thought if they could go to New York and survive, that I could too. So he comes to New York in 1946 and takes up photography because of a mentor that he had found, a man named Richard Poussadart, one of the great abstract expressionists, had said that this might be a way of making money. His friend that he met also, W. Eugene Smith, also said photography might be a way for you to make money. So he starts photographing the street around his neighborhoods, which first he lived on Perry Street, and then he came over to the East Village and lived on 10th Street, and that remains the neighborhood for him. He really loved the idea of a painter, an artist, or a writer staying in your neighborhood and photographing it. He didn't believe that you had to travel to far-off countries to make a statement. So throughout the 50s, he's using, well, first he's using black and white film, and then he switches to this new modern medium, color photography, Kodachrome, Anscochrome, Ektachrome, and starts shooting in color. And at that time, and for a long time afterwards, color was sort of seen as a slick and commercial. It wasn't really accepted. If you were a photographer, it was all in black and white. But miraculously, Saul rejected this idea and took up shooting with color film on a daily basis, and shot tens of thousands of images in the East Village, but then put them away. He got busy with a fashion career that gave him some money, Harper's Bazaar, Vogue, very, very, very well recognized in the fashion world for over 20 years. But these color photographs that he had taken in the 50s were just silently sitting there. And it wasn't until, believe it or not, the 90s when an art historian from London came over and found Saul, knew him because of his fashion work, and then Saul showed him these beautiful color slides, of which there are 3 examples. A foot on an L train, a black canopy, and the other one is an image called Through Boards. Probably 3 of his more famous photographs. But Saul was, he disdained self-promotion, and that was kind of the problem. And that's part of the reason why he didn't get recognition. He kept these slides together, and it wasn't until he got a grant in the 90s from a paper company called Ilford to print them. And it wasn't until much later that he actually had gallery representation here in Soho at Howard Greenberg Gallery. And when I met him in 1995, he had had one exhibition at Howard Greenberg Gallery of his black and white work. He hadn't shown his color work, hadn't been exhibited. People had only known of his color work in fashion. They had no idea what he had achieved in color until 1997, when the Greenberg Gallery had an exhibition of his color work. And I remember the day when he first brought in his color prints to show Howard Greenberg. It was a very, it kind of rocked Howard Greenberg's world because he was very traditional in terms of photography, and so was every photography gallery in New York. Everything was black and white. And Howard hesitated, and it was a hesitation that was immediately sensed by Saul. And Saul packed up those photographs and said, "These are not for you," and walked out.
Wow.
And that may have been the end of the story for Saul's recognition. But to Howard Greenberg's credit, called him that evening and said, yes, I think we can do something with it. Now this is before color photography was even in galleries like it is today. You see it everywhere. It wasn't even in the auction houses. It was nowhere. It was all about black and white photography. So I had the great fortune of working with Saul, but he only sold like 2 photographs a year, and he just did not, he wasn't able to have a sustainable money from his photographs, and really had decades where he wasn't making any money, and actually was in quite financial danger of just not surviving. He lived with his partner Soames on East 10th Street, and somehow they managed to get by. And in the 18 years that I was friends with him, more than half, he was a charity case. He didn't have money to pay the maintenance bill for his apartment. We seriously worried about him until this book came out called Early Color. And maybe I should pause there because I'm just rattling on. But Early Color, which is a book, his first book, came out in 2006. We spent 10 years trying to get publishers to publish it. And finally it came out in 2006, and it changed not only his life, but the history of photography. And we were getting calls from Europe. I was answering them because at that point I was a gallery associate. I was no longer a receptionist, and he was my guy. And people were calling from Paris saying, "Who is this Saul Leiter? Like, where did he come from, and why he did color in the 50s, and why haven't we, you know?" And I still get that question today, and I love that question because it's such a great story. Anyway, so we can talk more about Michael. Is my husband. In 2013, Saul Leiter passed away, and a year later we were able to create the Saul Leiter Foundation because he left everything in my hands. I was the one left holding the bag, as they said. And Saul thought it would be something for Margit to do in a continuation of what we had done together.
How much was there on the scene? I'm sorry but I just want to know.
Michael's going to talk about that.
Oh yeah, how much?
Well, to answer your question,
okay.
Siri,
Okay.
there was a lot. approximately 25,000 prints,
Oh, wow.
15,000 black and white, 10,000 color-ish, 4,200 paintings, 1,000 painted nudes. There's one, there's both a painting and a painted nude in the gallery. And his painted nudes, he used his own black and white nude photographs, and decades later he painted on them with watercolors. And 40, I like to think it's 40,000 slides, maybe there's 60,000 slides, and probably an equal number of black and white negatives.
Wow.
And the negatives are one of our next major projects. But just to get back to New York for a moment, Saul really loved New York, and the passage from Paul Auster that Moto read at the beginning of his talk really made me think of Saul in that he came here forever. Once he was here for good, and he was able to be who he wanted to be for the first time in his life, which is the opportunity that New York affords all of us. And he really embraced it. He was free from his parents. He said, people say that I came here to be a painter, but I really came here to escape my parents because their expectations were smothering him. And so he came and went while abstract expressionism was thriving. He had already started making paintings that sort of fit into that world. Saul was never really exactly part of any group, but he had a lot of friends, and he was on the periphery of certain groups, including, he knew a lot of the abstract expressionists, and he had a studio behind the Tanager Gallery on 10th Street, one of the great 10th Street galleries, and came and went and would tell stories about running into de Kooning on the street, and he would tell them, he told me about his fancy new record player for 20 minutes, you know, so I would talk about stuff like that. But he really began exploring all the things that his neighborhoods had to offer. First the West Village for a fairly short time, and then the East Village, as Margit mentioned. And all the while he was taking photographs inside his apartments of his friends and lovers, and so he was doing intimate work at home as well as roaming the streets and taking street photographs. And he went to Central Park a few times, he went to Midtown, Times Square, a memorable New Year's Eve full of photographs, but the vast majority of Saul's street photography was done in the blocks just around his home. And he was so attuned to what he saw, and you know, obviously, I've been thinking about that in terms of Auster and Leiter, how incredibly deeply sensitive these two artists were. And they were just attuned to ordinary moments and profound moments alike that a lot of people might miss or just not comment on, and they mined those moments in so many beautiful ways. I think Saul talked often about paying attention, and you just have to pay attention. And I read Paul Auster's Baumgartner recently, and there was a line that could have come out of Saul's mouth about if you're not attentive, then you're not fully alive, something like that.
I have to say that just listening to you, I have another kind of interesting overlap, which is the movie that Paul wrote, Smoke. And, you know, that is the neighborhood, a Brooklyn neighborhood, and Augie Wren is a photographer who takes the same corner every single day, right? And there's a moment that I really love in that movie where the two men are together, and Augie's sitting beside Paul Benjamin, which was played by William Hurt, and you know, Hurt is just paging through the same, and he says, it's all the same, it's all the same. And Augie says, slow down.
Yeah.
Different kinds of weather, different kinds of things. And I thought, that's a real overlap.
Yeah,
Right?
absolutely. I think that's one of the most magical aspects of Saul's work, is that he makes you slow down, pay attention, and he loved that he could evoke confusion in the viewer at first before they were able to slow down and start making sense of what they were looking at with so much refraction and mirror images and just mystery. And that's Saul Leiter's New York, is this quiet, mysterious New York that is not the in-your-face, brash representation, which is, of course, accurate, captured by many artists so beautifully. But he was more into the quiet moments, the ordinary moments that had incredible depth to them.
Here I would like to bring up the book that Russet Littleman, who's here with us tonight, put together. Oh, I'll just come here if we could bring it, thank you so much. And that was, Russet, what year was that, 2018? 2017, yeah. So it's called, and here it is, yeah.
It's all
a
thing.
Is there any way, Russet, that would you mind just coming here and take my mic? Just tell us a little bit about, because it's an incredible, so it's a collection called the Good Collection, which is between really America, New York, Paris, and Tokyo, which is also interesting because it's sort of the thread here.
The Gold Collection, it's a side hustle. It's not my primary activity. Three of us, a woman who's a photo editor at Le Monde in Paris, myself here in New York, and an editor in Tokyo, had a dear friend who died in 2015 of a glioblastoma. He was a massive collector and reader of literature, as well as photography books. So we try each year, every 2 years, we're not so precise because we're living lives with many other things going on, to put together a writer and a photographer from his library in Paris, which his wife still maintains. And there is, I love that you said, the decisive feeling. There is a decisive feeling to each book. And of course, New York was a decisive feeling for this. And Margit and Michael were so kind in letting us into a bit of the archives. And Carol Mann and Paul were so kind to let us use the story. And I have to give credit to my husband, who paired it. I do not take the credit. As we were going through the library, he pulled out Paul's book, and he pulled out Saul's book, and he said, "This is the match." And so hence we contacted all of you, and it's just it's a feeling, it's a moment, and listening to all your words, that's what I'm walking away from. This sense of an esprit, a feeling that we have. So thank you so much.
I've been thinking about how the book. Oh, I'm sorry. How the book. It shows very well that Saul wasn't a political artist. He wasn't making a statement. One of his big wonderful quotes is, "I don't have a philosophy. I have a camera." And I feel like the story, which feels autobiographical from Paul and not fictional to me, although I'm not certain about that.
No, it's not fiction.
Right.
No,
Yeah.
all those stories are real.
Okay. Yeah. There's the idea of coincidences in life that runs deeply through the story and also through the photographs. And I think it don't mean a thing. I could not imagine what Paul Auster was thinking, but I feel like that's the statement. The song comes up in the story, as I hope you'll find out, in a very concrete way, but I think metaphorically he's saying that these coincidences in life and beautiful moments, they just happen. They don't necessarily mean anything.
No, it's not fate.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
It's definitely not fate. He was very clear about that. It is the music of chance. And you have to be able to see it, right? There are patterns everywhere, and we look, and I used to tell him about number theory, and oh, Paul, but you know, the birthdays, of course, there's only 365 days of birthdays. But he loved seeing those patterns, but he also loved the fact that they do not have fatal meaning.
Yeah.
And you're absolutely right. You know,
It's
and it was
always
important
great.
to him. It was, one of his novels is called The Music of Chance. He also had a funny phrase that I wrote about after he died, called The Mechanics of Reality. And that was kind of the machinery of overlaps, people, you know, coming together at strange times. He loved those stories. But again, as I said to him, you have to be able to see it. Lots of people don't, right? They don't see it. But he loved these patterns that created maybe meaning for the person, but no fundamental, you know, transcendent meaning.
Thank you so much. Should we maybe open the floor to questions if anyone wants to ask?
I have a question to Sam. What was Paul like as a subject? You took photos of him?
He was fun.
Oh.
Well, Paul, first thing I would say was he was fun, he was warm, and he always spoke, he would tell great jokes, but everything he spoke what kind of was like the books, in the sense that, you know, he was the greatest storyteller I've ever met, and raconteur, but his stories weren't frivolous, even if the subject was frivolous. You know, there was always, like Paul once said to me, well, you make a work by, it comes out of your subconscious, but then you do something with it, then you look at it and you work with it. And I would say all of his stories to me, or being around him, was always like that. He would be talking about baseball or something else, but there was always layers to it. And one of the greatest moments I would say I remember was, and like Smoke, which I had to say, we put on again, we saw it, was like such an amazing film.
It is, that's a great.
And it also embodies this whole talk, because it's just people telling stories.
Yep.
You know, and everyone has a story if you're willing to meet someone and notice them and hear their story. But Paul was visiting us in LA, I would say, I can't remember if it was the late 90s or early 2000s. The Yankees were on the World Series, or it was the playoffs. And we were at our house and he was having dinner with Vim Vendors. And the game just never ended. It was an extra innings and extra innings and extra innings. And finally, I said, well, Paul, it's going to take us so long to drive up to where you're staying. He said, okay, well, we'll listen in the car. And we drove the car. So we drove up there, we get to his house, which was a rented house. And Paul goes, turn on the TV. He goes, I don't have a TV. He said, well, turn on the radio. I don't have a radio. And he said, well, we have to listen to the baseball game. And he said, I don't know anything about baseball. And so Paul had him move the dinner outside from the dining room, outside. And we played, and we kept the radio going on the car. And Paul was explaining the rules of baseball. And to vendors, you know, but when you even listen to the two of them talking about it, you realize how quickly the rules of baseball were more than just the rules of baseball. You know, and Paul loved to talk about baseball. You know, and the rules, and how if you change rules, or maybe you could, but thinking about it in layers. And I would say, whenever we came, he would always talk about something and notice things that, you know, how do you feel? And he would always be, when I left him, I always think of the Brooklyn Bridge, which I always put in my paintings of him because of that history of Lorca and Whitman and Paul, I think of as in Brooklyn. But he also inevitably would also talk about what was happening in the world. Right? He was so attuned to baseball, but what was happening in the world. But in a way, you know, he was incredibly human, but fun. And one time I think Paul got really mad at me, or disappointed maybe, was when he gave me his book of, remember he made that little book of jokes about baseball or something?
Oh, no, yes, that's yes, I know.
And,
no, tennis.
Yeah, no, tennis, right.
Tennis games you'd like to see, it was like.
Oh yeah, tennis games you'd like to see, it was a
I thought
word
that
thing.
was a secret.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, well, no.
Okay.
It was a tiny little book that he did with a friend, and they played with, you know, like I'm trying to remember, so, you know, somebody named Hand was playing with somebody named Fingers. You know, this kind of thing. And it's a whole list. And, you know, again, I was sort of the nudge, and I said, well, you can't have it completely open, you have to limit the number of, you know, like, anyway, he loved those games. And I guess you didn't respond with enough enthusiasm.
Yes, exactly. And Paul was
And
like,
neither did his wife
yeah.
always respond with enough enthusiasm. But anyway, he loved those things. He just loved them. And you're right, he was a very funny man. And sometimes when I go around in the world and I meet people and, you know, I don't know, he just had this reputation, you know, of the great serious guy. And I think, you know, if you read carefully, the humor is there too in the work, you know. So, you know.
And I just have to say, as someone who draws all the time, he was incredible to draw. Right? I mean, his eyes, you know, the spirit that he had that came through.
Yeah. He had a great face too. He was a beautiful guy.
But
he was.
But he never. But you know, it's funny that you say that, and other people say that all the time.
Yeah.
But as someone who's painted a lot of people, he never had that kind of ego about himself. At least I never
No,
sensed
he
it.
didn't.
And unlike, say, someone like Stanley Kuditz, who I also painted, and before I painted Stanley, he brought me into, he said, we were about to start, he said, oh wait, let me just show you something. And he brought me into this other room and he showed me a Phillip Guston drawing that he had made of him like years and years before. And then after I finished this painting of him that we were doing for Provincetown as a benefit, he said, yeah, it's good, but you know, but Phillip got my good side.
Well, that's funny. You know, in one of the letters I wrote him when I was, you know, 25, I say how you don't look in the mirror, which you didn't. You know, to shave. But he didn't have that kind of vanity about himself.
I'd just like to say how moving it is to talk about both Paul and Saul tonight, because for years we have been kind of amongst, well, maybe more with the Saul Leiter crew, but talking about those parallels. And with Moto and Motoyuki, you've been really central to this conversation because, and that's in fact, and Sayaka, thank you so much for making it happen. It is really through Sayaka that we thought, I can't even remember, it came from another photographer, that's another one of those long, but from a Japanese photographer that Sayaka represents, because Aya Fujioka, who had a show, and then we talked about Motoyuki and how, and I said, oh yeah, I know him because of the Saul Leiter book that he wrote in, and then that's about the time I had met Sam and talked about the photoplasms, and very organically this conversation came together. We had lunch at Veselka, with so Sayaka and Moto. We contacted everybody. Sadly, Spencer couldn't be here tonight, but he was going to be part of this conversation also. And so I just want to thank Sayaka very much for gathering.
The motto was, you know, I'm sure like he hated to hear this, but the motto was my hero since college. As I studied English literature in college, and so it's just like, and of course the Paul Auster Music of Chance was first English novel that I finished in English. I didn't read his. So yeah, it almost like if I myself in college knew this is something I would organize, 20 years later, like I don't think she would believe like it's just such a wonderful evening. And so I'll ask one question. Since Saul Leiter and both Paul Auster are very, very popular in Japan and also in France, so do you have any comments why do you think they are?
Maybe longtime, maybe I don't. Yeah, do you have an idea why?
Well, I taught at university for a number of years, and one thing I learned is that I could never guess what students would like. So if they like something, that's just a chance. You know? I could never figure out, you know, what. So this is just, I'm just saying that I cannot answer your question. I don't know. I mean, they are both great artists, that's it. I don't know.
I've had a few theories along the way.
Okay, let's hear. Yeah.
And one of them is that Saul Leiter absolutely loved Japanese art. It was he called calligraphy humankind's greatest achievement, Japanese calligraphy, and he owned so many Japanese art books and was conversant in the woodblock artists and had had ukiyo-e prints on his wall that he owned, and I think that it was inevitable that some of that sensibility came through him, and maybe in Japan that was recognized by the public in some subliminal way. I could go on, but I know Margit.
And Sam mentioned the complete lack of ego about Paul, and I feel the same way about Saul's self-portrait, and these two artists are quite different, almost the opposite of the typical image of American artists, full of ego. So I think that's very refreshing to Japanese audience.
I think that's right.
Saul, I think, used a lot of themes. He was influenced by the Japanese woodblocks, hokusai and others. The temporal elements, the weather, the snow, people doing domestic things, sitting in rooms, and also the sort of voyeuristic qualities that I think that you might see. In fact, Pauline wrote a beautiful essay in one of our Saul Leiter books about Saul's influences.
Which there's a copy of.
Which is
all
out
about
there.
Saul.
Yeah.
Well, that was when we said it would be great to introduce Saul Leiter in a bigger way in Japan, and so that's when we looked at all the books. So in the library of Saul Leiter were so many books of Japanese, so ukiyo-e and hokusai. So that's the book.
Saul had about 2,000 books, we think, in his library. Michael says 3,000 is right. And about 10% were Japanese.
Right, and so in there was the connection, because he also loved Vuillard and Bonnard, and so there was this whole confluence of the French and the Japanese influences. But I think, so I was thinking about this too, why Japan and France in particular, for both Paul Auster and Saul Leiter, and I feel like it's because of the lack of ego, there's so much room to get in, and it's something that's not, so I think that's part of it.
That's a very smart comment. You know, Paul and I used to talk a lot about what to take out and what to leave in. And I think in his case, I mean, we discussed this quite a bit, that a book has to be open enough to enter. You know, there are texts very dense. I mean, there's some great writers who have very dense texts. But I think for him, and I mean, I was very interested in Beckett, that there's a kind of opening. I mean, Beckett was a taker-outer. Joyce was a putter-inner. but I think, again, that there's that entryway, that openness, the spaces between. And that might be, just what you said, I thought that was so terrific.
Really good. Can I add, I think it was Moto that said flaneur.
No, I said flaneur.
Yes, and that
The men always get it. It happens to me all the time.
Well,
People
these two men deserve it.
quote, and it's, no, I said it, flaneur.
Well, that word has been applied, I think it was Max Kozloff in his essay that used that word. And I think that to be that way, I think you have to be a little bit egoless, don't you? To be a wanderer and an observer.
Recede.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, and everybody, thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
others, but if you have any questions, you want to ask us directly.
Could I ask?
Maybe.
One question, a very quick question. As Margit knows, my stepfather is a Howard Greenberg photographer, art illegal, and I grew up with his taking hundreds of photographs, and I wonder how someone who was having economic difficulties the way Saul Leiter did could have so many negatives. How did he pay for the film?
Yes. Good idea. That's a good question.
Well, a lot of what he acquired was in his early career, and his success in the fashion world funded his ability to purchase materials. When he was much less well off, a little later in life, before the book came out, he did a lot of painting on cardboard strips that you would put between wine bottles to stop them from clinking together. He had paper.
He bought expired film.
Yeah, well, yeah, right. And by that point, later in his life, when he really had no money, he did have a few digital cameras eventually, and he loved the fact that he could just fill up cards and not have to edit. He'd throw the card in a bowl and get another. So he was sort of floated along by some of his friends a bit, but he wasn't really buying much in terms of supplies during those really lean years.
Okay. No, and, the Greenberg Gallery did give, what would we call it, like an advance. That gallery has such faith in Saul. He really has just almost no money for decades, and when he needed money, the gallery would advance him. Yeah, and that's how he survived for almost 2 decades.
Any photographer associated with Howard Greenberg Gallery was lucky.
Yeah,
And still is.
Yeah. For street photography, that and mid-century, that gallery had amazing contributions for sure. Yeah. More questions?
Any more questions?
We're suddenly in the mood.
The last chance. Okay, so then, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So,